already knows what I was about to say, and I filtered. It's this rare sight. I filtered. Wow.
Yeah. Um, I think.
All the things? All the things are working?
Oh, wait a minute! I got news. I got news. Keep talking.
Who's
Talk
joining
amongst
us now?
yourselves.
Is Walls joining us? Is that what's going to happen?
Oh, wait. Wait for it.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
The man, the
there.
myth, the legend is with us, and we're live, Shane, just so you know.
All right,
100%
very
live
good.
from the get go.
Hey,
No, at the top of the hour, we'll start. Shane, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Today's day number 9, and it's been. I tell you, this virus wears you out. It's just really fatiguing. But I've never had a fever, so I'm really really blessed that it's not gotten any worse than that, and just a little cough and congestion, and mainly fatigue. So
Well, it's good to hear your voice, though slightly congested that it is. We'll have to solve some mysteries later.
yes, yes. Well, I'm getting my tea ready right now, as a matter of fact. So.
Wait a minute. How did you prepare that tea? That tea, was it bagged or loose leaf? These are important questions that Brother
Yeah.
Walls was passed out in a brisket coma will want to know in the future.
Yes, this was Twining's Irish breakfast tea, and I did it with a bag, and
Oh,
so I'm in
Michael
the
Walls is so disappointed in you.
I'm in the early stages of this. I'll tell you, I had no idea what a passionate community the tea drinking community was until I put that question out on Facebook. Those people are fanatics.
They are quite committed. They are quite committed is an accurate representation.
They're almost as committed to that as Mark Roberts is to his form of making coffee.
I was going to say they're fanatics and committed because they're trying to pretend like they're drinking something as awesome as coffee.
I agree. I concur. By the way, Mark Roberts does know how to brew really good coffee. Let me throw that out there.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually use the Mark Roberts pour over system, which is, oh, wow, it's amazing. So, just a plug.
All right.
What are the few things I agree with Mark about?
Um, this is the Mega Zoom. We're about to start here officially talking about official things. There may
Is
be
there
a
a
few others
question
that
to start us
straggle.
off, Phil? Is there a question today?
Do you want a question?
I just feel like we have to do a question. Like, I don't think it would be a do the work video without the question. You didn't think about this?
Well, I did, but I also knew we had a number of knuckleheads. And so to answer any question is going to take at least 13 minutes as a very precise estimate. But I'll do it this way. We're going to go around the horn really quickly. Favorite Bible version that no one thinks you would like?
Oh, boy. Who's going to start?
Chris,
Emerson. Let Emerson go.
Chris's fingers up.
I would say the updated NIV. I used to rail against NIV and talk about what junk it was, and I did this whole sermon on how junky, and I decided to pull one off the shelf and check it, and most of the verses I hated had been altered in the update and were actually pretty good. So updated
Preach
NIV.
that sermon again.
Had to preach it again.
Edwin, what you got?
I truly have no answer to that question whatsoever.
Edwin only likes one version of the Bible.
Mark,
No,
go.
but I don't guess I like anyone that I think would shock people. So
Yeah.
Well,
Mark?
mine would be the ESV since
That's right.
I've recently come around. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I enjoy reading the New Living Translation.
All right. Mark Dunnigan. I got 2 marks now, so I've got to really, Mark D. What you got?
I don't have an entire version. I've always liked the NIV of Leviticus 10 that they offered unauthorized fire. I've liked that rendering of that verse.
Gotcha. Terry?
Well, I was tempted to say the word on the street, but that wouldn't be true. I really like the message a lot of times. I mean, I think the message has a really good
Gene.
way of saying things that, kind of help explain it even better. I mean, I'm an ESV guy. I switched to that from really the New King James, I guess, years ago. But I really like the message. I do.
Senor Scott?
I like the New Century Version, although I think it may have a different name. It's a translation that's aimed at kids, but so I often recommend it to parents when they want a translation when their kids are really starting to read on their own. But I find that it's really clear, and in a lot of places when I'm kind of dumbfounded with the best phrases to look at in other translations, I'll go check it out, and it's got great clarity.
As from me, I like kind of like Edwin. I read all of them, and there's no like. I don't think there'd be any surprises that I like the Message, and I like the Amplified, and I like even some of the really obscure, almost mock you style ones, because I find them interesting to see how other people approach the scriptures, even if they're trying to be derivative. I want to know what people think about the Bible, particularly its biggest critics. And so I read through some of those as well. I read recently a portion of the Old Testament poetry from the International Standard Version. It's a new update, and it has done something interesting with the Old Testament poetry. It's placed it to modern meter. And so in the translation, they've metered it in a way to give it maybe a more poetic format. And I find that really cool. I still don't have a deep opinion on its value as a translation yet, but I'm super intrigued about that part of the Old Testament translation process. Chris?
Phil, did anybody order the Biblioteca from Adam Green from years ago? It's I don't know what you call it, Edwin. Do you know what they call it? They took the ASV,
pull it out.
kind of ironed it out a little bit.
It's his own translation, is what it is, really.
It's really good to me.
I think he picked a translation and then he changed some things. He picked it
was the ASB, wasn't it?
Something like that.
I thought it was the ASB because there was free domain and he had the ability to do that.
He took public domain. Translated out of the original tongues, being the version set forth Anno Domini 1611, the revision 1881, the American edition 1900, newly edited 2016. He calls it the American Literary Version.
That's it. That's solid. It's probably expensive now. We got it cheap because I had to wait 2 years for it. But
no kidding.
Yeah, on my birthday, it was really cool.
One other I saw recently that I think is just really a beautiful thing is they've made a modern illuminated edition, which is basically like a coffee table translation presentation of the ESV. So they have the ESV text with new high quality photos, glossy pages, large space around it. And so it's kind of like a modern illuminated text, physical text.
I've seen advertised on Facebook the Alabaster.
Yeah, that's one of the versions of it. Yeah. And those are really interesting to me too, just because of the standpoint of the art of textual presentation.
They're using the New Living Translation in those.
Yeah. Chris?
So this year for my daily Bible reading, I've been going through the ESV Readers, the 6-volume Readers edition, and I'll tell you, it has really been enjoyable.
I got that. That's great.
And of course, you can set it up on your iPad to basically be the same thing through Logos or the ESV app, and I'm sure others can too. But it is a really neat way to read the Bible.
When I was reading Genesis, it was funny. I've told this several times, but I was reading Genesis and I got caught up in the story because there were no chapter divisions and everything. And about 3/4 of the way through the first genealogy, I realized I was actually reading genealogy for the first time. Because when there's no verse divisions and setting it off like normal, you read it more like a story, and you don't realize that's the section you're supposed to skip. And there's a lot of stuff in there that you read in the story format that you normally just skim through because you don't want to get bored with the genealogies and trying to pronounce these names. And it's pretty fantastic.
Bill, a number of people out in Oregon I know ordered that from Apologetics Press, that Defending the Faith study Bible that has a lot of comments on apologetics. And I guess being from the West Coast and the faith and their fire so much out there that on our trip, that's what I took with me to start just reading that and seeing what their comments are. So thus far, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Chris,
it only took 6 minutes
earlier before Terry quiets down. I thought you raised your hand earlier.
No, that's cool. I mean, I was gonna say that we always talk about Bible marking and like
color drawing.
That's fine, but you also need to read without that. Like I go into it and I'm already keyed up to everything I've always thought. So you guys all know that. But if somebody's tuning in and they're thinking, how can I use a bunch of preacher banter? Have a Bible that you love to mark and make notes in, but also have a reader, pick a different version, and just empty your head and read. So I didn't do that for a long time. I thought I'm just going to keep, piling on, but cleaning the slate was really helpful.
That was one
Emerson's
of my problems
Bible. Well, I was just going to Emerson's Bible looks oddly like Timothy Keller's outline with all the marking up on it.
Y'all picking on Tim Keller? I love that guy. By the way, that was a year or two ago right there.
That was one of my problems reading the Net Bible. There are so many footnotes in it that you get so disjointed. I mean, there's some great stuff in it, but I was like, I want to get more of a context than, I mean, it's almost like a word by word study rather than trying to understand a context.
It's a great resource. It's not a great translation. There's a difference between those two things.
Wait, I didn't think you read. So should I take your word for it?
I'm a man of many layers. How about that?
Oh, so you're an onion. I get it.
Yep.
Well, he stinks.
Yep.
He makes me cry.
I'm a purple onion. Y'all go ahead. Go ahead.
Are we ready to go ahead?
Hey, you mess with the boy, get the horns. I just want to remind y'all that.
I'm trying to pull this out. Here we go.
What are you? Are you a Texas or an A&M guy, by the way, Emerson? Which one are you?
I graduated from the University of Houston. Nobody likes to talk about the Cougs, but I don't know. I'm just a Texas guy. I'm the state of Texas guy. Like, I can pull for either one. I can even pull for my homie out there and Tech. I can do it all.
How long will you falter between two opinions?
If I can make that work.
That's Timothy Keller's outline he preaches from. That's what we're talking about. That's
That's the rantings of a lunatic.
Hey, he's got some great thoughts. I don't want to be inside that head. That's all I'm saying. If he can read through that and understand it. Whew.
I'm not quite sure how it makes the process from page to speech.
Have you ever, hey, by the way, Shane Scott, have you ever seen a Tommy Peeler outline? Have you ever seen one of his?
I have not.
Looks oddly familiar to Timothy Keller's. I'm just going to
is that
throw that
right?
out there. Oh, yeah. You just don't ask him for his notes. You'll never be able to understand them. Love the guy.
That's probably
Great guy.
why they're in code. That's probably why they're in code. He doesn't want to get the secrets getting out. So let's dig into what we've got on the table. So we're looking at 1st and 2nd Corinthians today as an ensemble, the correspondence as a package. We've got a couple of things that are important for us to talk about. We kind of pre-discussed this a little bit. What we want to hear from each of you and also from those who are following along is I want to know what kind of takeaways you've encountered in this recent study. Because there's two ways that preachers tend to look at the text. We talked about this before. We look at it from the standpoint of we're going to teach stuff. And so we plan our takeaways. We plan what the important things are. But for those who are on the other end of the information process, very often what we plan for them to think are the big things aren't actually the things that they remember or latch on to. And they will very often find great gold in the mine of that study that we didn't even know we brought. And so I'm curious, as one of our questions, things that you encountered in 1st or 2nd Corinthians through this study or recent studies in the text that were surprises to you as Bible students, maybe helped you rethink something, maybe you knew something, but now you're digging into it a second time. By the way, there's a number of folks joining. Dan DeGarmo says hello. So all of a sudden, our metric is going to go from like 5 people watching to 5,000 people watching. Paula, it's good to see you there as well. And actually, we've got someone watching from Nepal today. So nice spread across the globe. Farther travels, and even Mark Dunnigan has gone recently. So what do you guys see there? Or other things are really important for us to pay attention to right now. And as we kind of go through it, we will try to do our best not to talk over everybody. And like Mark Russell said earlier, go. Nobody moves. Everyone's scared.
I think you need to call on somebody.
I'm going to call on Edwin because he spoke.
That was not what I was saying.
Well, that's what I was saying.
Well, the struggle is for me, studying Corinthians, listening to you guys when I've been able to tune in, and times I wasn't here, and then the weeks that you let me be a part of it also, and then just study outside. It's hard for me to distinguish between what came from our conversations and maybe it all just blends together, and that's how Bible study is supposed to work. But for me, and I even preached a lesson on this recently, was just the reminder of how, especially the first letter to the Corinthians, is anchored in unity, and how much division and struggle there is going on in the Corinthian church, and what Paul says in response to that. I mean, they had almost like every kind of strife and division and disunity that you could have, and Paul is just having to plod through each one, and his advice on that. I really believe that that's very important right now, and it's good to be going through that letter in the midst of a time where I'm afraid that because of everyone's different perspectives on some very practical, pragmatic things right now, there's a lot of disunity coming out, and it hurts my heart. But it's the way they were in Corinth, and we can get into that and figure out how to handle it just like Paul taught.
Yeah. Mark Russell? You're muted, bro. You're muted.
Nah, I'm not now. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here. All joking aside, it was an honor, and it stretched me further than I had been stretched in a while, because not only with COVID, but in other ways and in other situations, my stretch across things has been limited. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about these letters is, as pointed as Paul was, especially in 1 Corinthians, he still called them brethren. And that unity that Edwin mentioned here is something that it's always struck at me, because honestly, let's admit, Christians aren't always the best about being unified. We aren't always the best about being forbearing. And the fact that he calls them brethren, and being stretched along that line, and also being stretched in being called on, like when Phil said go, my first thought was, oh dear, what do I have to offer? But it is very interesting, and I appreciate all of you and all the other times that I've been able to watch how passionate all of you guys are about the Lord and about his word. And it stretched me because, I've been blessed to have been in Valparaiso for a long time. And one of my shortcomings is I can kind of get in a rut. And this has pushed me out personally and made me think about things and try to look at things and challenge my views on, like, 1 Corinthians 13, challenge my views on 1 Corinthians 11, challenge my views on, all manner of things. And I think this is pretty awesome.
We'll just go around my version of the setup here, and Mark Dunnigan, you're up next. And by the way, that means Chris and Shane are on deck. Terry gets to go last because he's just here to grump.
Well, Phil, and this kind of keys in with something I've been thinking about recently. In the first letter, I think you see how quickly people can go from darkness to light, chapter 6. I mean, these people have been in deep addictive sins, homosexuality, fornication, adultery, etc., of how quickly you can change, that you can cold turkey a lot of stuff overnight when you realize my soul's on the line. And like Saul of Tarsus, those sort of things, of just how amazing transformation can happen in a person's life. But almost like in the first letter and the second letter, you also learn how quickly you can go from light to darkness. And I think the thought is that it seems to me, Phil, there's a number of people out there that feel, if I stop attending or if I kind of fall away, yeah, a few things in my life might go kind of off kilter a little bit, but for the most part, I'll stay on the rails. And the thing that really impresses me as I grow older, about 40 years of being a Christian now, is that when I became a Christian, I knew that my sins would be forgiven and I'd have a home in heaven. And there were things I was doing and I wouldn't do anymore. But I didn't realize that in becoming a Christian, Phil, every single corner and aspect of my life has been touched by the gospel. That there is not a single aspect of my life that the gospel has not transformed. Whether my mental health, physical health, finances, marriage, friendships, everything. And I guess that's the thing that I would stress upon, like a new Christian or a babe in Christ, is that just don't think that becoming a Christian kind of is going to touch this corner, but no. And not only that, but the person you marry is going to touch every single corner of your life as well. I guess just there's not a single aspect of your life that's going to remain unchanged when you obey the gospel, or if you don't obey the gospel. And I know a lot of people are fearing the virus and things like that. In Oregon, they got the wildfires. Here's the thing to fear. Here's the thing to fear. Fear becoming more and more like yourself instead of more and more like Christ. Chapter 11, verse 1. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Chris?
First of all, we are praying, we are, for those in Oregon. You mentioned Beaverton, and I've got some friends up there who messaged yesterday and asked if we would put them in our announcements and in our prayers here. So praying for those. Got my friend Jordan White's probably tuning in today, so prayers for them. A couple of things about Corinthians. I wish we could go back and do 1 Corinthians 11 again. I just finished the LaGard Smith book, The Radical. Yeah, I'd love to go back and talk about that again. So for me, even though I've been preaching, 20 years, my familiarity level with 1 Corinthians is probably 10 times higher than 2 Corinthians. Taught 1 Corinthians a bunch of times, preached from it. I watched Edwin's sermon the other day where he was walking through the problems in 1 Corinthians. I thought, yep, we know that pretty well, and it's very useful. We look at this church and we think, boy, you wouldn't even go visit there, and yet he speaks so positively in chapter 1 and optimistically. 2 Corinthians, over the years, I've used little sections of it for things, but in terms of understanding the flow and really the same kind of continuity, I was really low on that. So last year I did a class on it and it helped, but it was only one run through. I've been through 1 Corinthians 20 times. Anyway, I enjoyed the study because I felt like I was able to understand the flow of 2 Corinthians better. And I would advise people to just read it through. Don't just grab the chapters that you need. And here's my observation. In Hebrews 5, he talked about how I wish I could teach you heavier things, but I've got to go back to the basic things. I appreciate that he did not do that with the 2 Corinthian letter. You would think that a church like this with all these problems, it's kind of barely hanging on, that he would come in the second letter and take them back to these baby fundamental steps. But he kind of comes in 2 Corinthians and says, look, guys, you've got problems. We've addressed those problems, but we've got work to do. And so he talks about his willingness to suffer and the sacrifices and the mission and the giving and the contribution. And I think I came away thinking, if the church in Lindale has some fundamental problems, and this year, reveals things about churches, we'll address those, but it doesn't mean we dumb down the preaching for the next 6 months until we get off of milk again. Like, we have real work to do. We have real sacrifices to make, and we're in this for something serious. So I kind of liked when I put the two together and learned it, that, you can deal with fundamental problems and major disappointments, but it doesn't mean you lower your goals for that church for the next year. I mean, we still want to have that sacrificial spirit and be mission oriented.
Shane?
One of the things that really has stuck out to me going through these books again is that not that we as preachers are in the same place as the Apostle Paul, but Paul over and over again makes decisions in the way that he handles his relationship with the Corinthians that could either look favorable or unfavorable to him, but all he's really concerned about is what is best for the Corinthians themselves. And so many times in these letters, he talks about what he's doing is for their sake. Like in 1 Corinthians 2, when he talks to them about how to handle the brother who is now repenting and what they should do. And when he talks about financial support. And I think that it's a really difficult thing for us as preachers sometimes to sort of step out and look at our relationship with our churches from a third person point of view and say, if this was anybody else, what would the right thing be for them to do with regard to the best interests of the congregation? And sometimes it may look like you're trying to do something to your advantage or to your disadvantage, but trying to keep that immaterial and just simply focusing on what is best for the church given our commitment to Jesus Christ. And that's the way that Paul over and over again handles himself with regard to the Corinthians. And I think it's an important lesson for me certainly to bear in mind.
Yeah, most definitely. Terry?
Well, so just to tie into a couple things, Chris said in 2 Corinthians he doesn't take them back to the milk, but he does in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, which is pretty interesting when you think about it. And I preached past weekend on faith and how that applies to our unity, and I kind of talked to Philip and Edwin about this, but I referenced 1 Corinthians because in Hebrews 5, he tells them to go back to the milk because they're not sharing their knowledge. That's more of an attachment to a knowledge. They're not teaching. But in 1 Corinthians 3, when he tells them to go back to the meat, he tells them to go back to the meat because they're divided, because they're not getting along. He tells them that they're not spiritual people. They're fleshly, and so they need to start all over, kind of like this rebooting of your faith kind of process. Why I find that interesting, and what I talked about on Sunday, is just so often we think about faith and unity, we think about the fact that we're unified because we share the same faith, and that is part of it. But the other part of it that I see in 1 Corinthians is unity is actually part of your faith. Like, you have to understand that part of the response of faith, and kind of the spirit of James 2, that by my works I can show you my faith, is the unity you have with brethren. And I think that's one of the things you kind of see tied throughout 1 Corinthians is this problem of they have come a long way from where they came from, but they need to go back and kind of get the unity part right, which is such a major part of faith. And I think, quite honestly, especially during this past several months while I've been doing this, I just see that we really struggle with that concept that faith is actually, unity is part of our faith. Like, it is part of the belief system. It's not something that results from our belief and our response. It's part of our belief and our response. And I think because we've kind of separated those two things, it makes it easier for me to disagree with people over things that don't really matter, because I don't see it as a part of my faith. I just see it as something that should result. So in a way, what we do is we compartmentalize all that and go, well, we agree on Jesus and we agree on God and we agree on baptism, but since I don't agree on this thing over here, I don't have to love you through that. I can be a complete and total jerk about that because that's not part of the faith. And the reality is that fellowship and unity includes all of that stuff. And that's part of what defines us. I mean, Jesus said that how we got along would be how the world knows that we actually are faithful disciples. It's just such an important part. And I just think that in this study, I've kind of seen that. And it's interesting to kind of tie into this other thing is that despite all those problems, still a great church. I mean, I think that's the other thing is I get frustrated sometimes as one of the guys in leadership who sees, quite frankly, because here's the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. If we're preaching full time, this is like pretty much all we think about. This is our job in that sense. So other people that even leadership have a secular job and that dominates part of their time, we spend literally hours a day thinking, and we also see all of the issues. There's this overwhelming thing, and if I'm not careful, I can get so discouraged by all the negatives that I think, man, there's just no hope. And then you look at a church like this one, who's really messed so many things up, morally, their fellowship, abusing their gifts. I mean, you look at all of the things that they've messed up in the process, and Paul still loves them and says, hey, this is still a great church. You just got some things you got to fix. And it helps me remind myself, hey, every church has some things you're going to fix. Look, there's no perfect church. If I go there, I'm going to mess it up. I know that. So the reality is that's part of this as well. So faith includes our unity. And look, we're always a work in progress as a group, as in individuals. I see that all of that from the study of these two books.
Chris?
Terry, just to follow up, and that maybe I can put it in the form of a question, but I feel like sometimes we treat everybody like they're the guy in 1 Corinthians 5 who had his father's wife. Like, anything you do I don't like, anything you believe that I disagree with, what I need to do is 1 Corinthians 5 you. I need to deliver you over to Satan. And maybe do you see that in this letter it's all sin is sin, but then in a sense in the way you approach it and discipline it, it's not all the same. Do you see some distinction between those two things?
I'll answer your question in a second because everyone else has already spoken and been forced to answer questions, at least from my perspective. But I want to make a quick observation. looking at the screen that I see, I realized that the key to longevity at a local congregation is to be named Mark. Because the evidence suggests that if you're named Mark, you're going to be able to work with the same congregation for a significant period of time. You guys should talk later. But in answer to Chris's question, I think that's a struggle for all of us. We don't always critically think through where we are in response to our perception of another one's spiritual turmoil. Either we're going to be sucked into it and committed with them, and we're afraid of that, so we cut off that relationship, or we've determined that there's no hope and they won't listen to us, so we cut off that relationship. And it's always about this severance. When you see Paul doing a lot more of the suiting up and going into tragedy to avert more tragedy. It doesn't mean that sin is not dealt with. He does. He does deal with it pointedly and directly. And he does so with compassion and conviction. And if you took the wisdom of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians with the command to be more like Christ in both of those letters, you're going to end up with more motivation to reach out and call to the fallen, call to the faltering, call to the fallen. I think you see that throughout both of these letters in the larger picture of all this. And even beyond that, there's a second picture taking place. That culture in Corinth was much more pervasive in their relationships than is seen on the first layer, the first look, or the first picture of the book. For Terry, he needs picture books. So I think there's
Speaking
a lot
of loving your brethren.
Yeah, I love Terry, and I like him too. But I think that's a big thing for us right now. How often do we move emotionally because of our political worldview, or our favorite pontificator worldview, or even our favorite academic institution worldview, rather than, I read this about Jesus and I want to be like this because I want to be like Jesus. Mark is handling something real quick. I was going to go to him because I had a question, but Edwin, you got to unmute yourself first.
I really appreciate that last statement about being like Christ. And regarding the issue of unity, one of the things that I really got out of 1 Corinthians is that statement at 11:1, which really ought to be at the end of chapter 10. If you were reading one of those ones you talked about earlier that didn't have chapter and verse breaks, I think you'd pick up on that, where Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And what often happens is we jump to that, we see it's the first verse, we read it all by itself, as if what Paul was saying was, whenever I'm doing what Jesus does, you need to do that. And obviously that's true. When anybody's imitating Christ, we ought to imitate what they're doing at that time. But what he's really saying is this stuff from chapter 8 through chapter 10 about meats offered to idols and all of the issues he has about unity. And there he basically talks about sacrifice. And he talks about his approach to why he will become as under the law for those who are under the law, why he will be as weak for those who are weak. And what he says is, imitate me as I imitate Christ. His point is, you need to do what I'm doing on this, because when I'm doing this, I'm doing what Jesus did. And the point is, when Jesus went to the cross, that was sacrifice. It was, I want people saved. I will do anything and everything to help people be saved. And so one of the things I shared with our congregation this last week on this lesson from 1 Corinthians is that when we see that passage about imitate Christ, it's not WWJD. WWJD is like the first level, the entryway into becoming like Christ. It's not, oh, here's this situation. I wonder what Jesus would have done here. We know what Jesus did. Jesus left heaven, came into the world, went to the cross. And so becoming more like Jesus and applying that to my relationship with my brothers and sisters in the congregation doesn't just mean in every situation figuring out, I wonder how Jesus would handle this. It means, I wonder what going to the cross for my brother or sister right here looks like, because that's what Jesus did. He went to the cross for them.
Mark, Russell.
In listening to everyone here, I appreciate so much this. And one of the things that I talked earlier about how it stretched me is just simply my view of how Paul is addressing these brethren. There was a time early on, and Chris, I understand, you go through First Corinthians probably a lot more than Second Corinthians, but there was a time that I looked at Paul as a chastising teacher. But this time reading through it, it's kind of like in 1 Thessalonians 2, I hear him imploring them. I hearing him pleading with them as a father or a mother, as a parent. And it changes, especially 1 Corinthians, it changes everything. There are issues that need to be addressed, and we're ready to address them, but I'm not addressing you as some sort of subservient people. I'm not addressing you. I'm not lording it over you, which is honestly the way a lot of leaders do things. They talk down to the people and they expect compliance before they expect love and self-sacrifice. And I hear a pleading out of Paul, and especially also more in 2 Corinthians, where this means everything to him. He loves these people. He's not just trying to get something out of them.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of pay attention to that bigger picture of relationship that he has with the church at Corinth, because it's not just in these two letters, it expands into a fuller sense of everyone he sent there, the impact that those souls were having on others, their service to churches and brethren elsewhere. The primary text we pull out of 2 Corinthians has to do with their relationship to other believers and their commitment to other believers at times. The same thing is true. Think about one of my favorite illustrations of what Christ's work should end up being, that people can see that we believe in Jesus because of the way we love disciples. They should be able to see that in us. And I think that's something that Carl Peterson picks up on. He says, he thinks 1 Corinthians 16:14 gets to the heart of this across both letters. Do everything in love. There's a lot of power to that type of relationship. You are willing to do more if your heart is willing to offer more. And I think that's something that is sometimes lost on us in American culture, because we quantify and put stats behind everything. That kind of interpersonal relationship is really hard to maintain right now. Even in congregations who did not go through the cycle of assembly adjustment, their entire lives are being adjusted in ways that make everybody uncomfortable. And the minute you're uncomfortable, you get cranky. And if you get cranky long enough, your crankiness just flows out to everybody else. Shane?
Yes, nice segue, crankiness, right to Shane Scott. So I appreciate that. But one of the things that sort of dovetails into the great comments you guys have made about the love that Paul had and the Christ-centeredness of it is also the mission-centeredness of it, which these things all go together. But there at the end of 1 Corinthians 9, when he talks about, I've become all things to all men, and he lists all the different social and ethnic categories, and he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. I think that that's been a really important thing for all of us in this weird year to bear in mind, that all of the decisions we should be making should be made on behalf of the mission that we have to spread the gospel, to invite people to come to Jesus and help each other become like Jesus. And that's why I know I'm just speaking personally in my own preaching and also in my congregation. Sometimes we've been a little bit off kilter this year, because this has been such a disruptive year that if you don't keep that sense of mission front and center, you can go in a million different directions, or you can become so inwardly focused on all of these little disputes that inevitably come up, that if everybody just can keep in mind, hey, we have a mission So let's use these circumstances and figure out how to use them for the sake of the mission. It really can help keep you focused. That's a big point that kind of dovetails into the other things that have been shared today.
Muted, Phil.
Should be speaking right now.
So I think I've used improper language in the past. I'd use language like the Apostle Paul is defending himself. In these letters in 2 Corinthians, he defends himself. In Galatians, he defends, but he's not really doing that, is he? He's defending the mission. He's defending 1 Corinthians 2:2, that all I really want to do is know Christ Jesus and Christ crucified, and I want you to know Christ and Christ crucified. He's not defending himself. He's explaining why he's willing to sacrifice. He's explaining what his life's about. And I think that that's really, really key and crucial to understanding that he never made it about him. Even when he was making it about him, it wasn't really about that. It was about, let me explain why I'm living this life. And he tied it all back to Christ. I think that's beneficial for preachers and teachers. There's a time when you have to say, okay, everybody, look at me. I want to tell you about the life I'm living, but be careful. I'm not defending myself so that you will listen to me. I'm trying to explain that I've emptied myself to fill myself with Christ, and that's why I'm preaching these things. If they can't tie your defense back to Jesus, you're not defending the mission. And I'm talking to myself. I've got guys in the room here, but I'm really just thinking through how I've worded Paul's language. Here's what he's doing, when really that's not what he's doing. He's doing something else through his own story.
Yeah, Philip, if I could just quickly tag team back in with Chris here. That point really came home to me in chapter 13 of the second letter, when Paul says in verse 4 that Christ was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. We also are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live by him. All the times that Paul talked about weakness, especially in the second letter, which was one of the bases on which some of his critics were attacking him. The reason it is such a problem, as Chris just said, is not because of what it means about Paul, but if you have a problem with a weak apostle, how are you ever going to follow a weak savior? But that's exactly what Christ was. You know, he came in weakness and gave himself. And the issue was not what it was going to mean about Paul's reputation. It was going to affect their own faith in Jesus Christ. And that's an example of what I meant at the very start. When Paul defends himself, I mean, you can't really get around saying that language in a way, as Chris said. What he's really doing is helping them to understand the ramifications for Christ. And it's an example of what I meant when I said a preacher can do things that may seem to be self-centered, but it's actually for the benefit of the congregation.
I was going to ask Mark Duggan this, in part because of his deep experience in preaching in a culture that is much more dynamic than some of us have experienced. Being in the Northwest, particularly in Beaverton, Portland zone, means that not only is the world around you swirling, at times brethren get caught in those swirls, and that can change at least in a couple areas. Some of the changes are merely external style, behavioral, interest stuff. And that's one layer of conflict that sometimes takes place, is how do we handle that? But it also does impact specifically and significantly at times local churches. That culture kind of creeps in. And from your perspective, how has 1st and 2nd Corinthians as a message from the divine helped the church there at Beaverton over the years? Has your approach to preaching through that text changed? I'm appealing to your experience and expertise. And I know that you've got manuscripts of your sermons because you're a manuscript preacher and you've done a lot of expository preaching over the years. So, but it's probably all written in paper. But what's your thoughts there?
Good question, Phil. I think one thing in Beaverton that made things really well there is the men. There are some really spiritual men there. I think women can keep a group kind of going, but I don't know if you can grow it without the men. Don't underestimate strong spiritual men in a congregation. I think you're right, Phil. I've seen it. There's the danger of the church to become like the culture. I see that sometimes in government towns, Phil, that are 9 to 5 government towns, and the church starts becoming kind of like a 9 to 5. I'm only going to do what I really need to do. I'm not going to do anything extra. There was something I think it helped us in Beaverton, Phil. In the Portland area, there's a lot of entrepreneurs, and that entrepreneurial spirit came with some of the members in a good way. That is, I'm going to go beyond, what would be the word? It would be like 2 Corinthians 12:15. I'm going to spend myself out, and I'm just not going to do the bare minimum. And I know that was present there, and I think still is in Beaverton. There was a number of people that started their own businesses or whatever, and that was part of who they were as a person of, I'm not going to play it safe. I'm going to take risks, and I'm going to do all that I can do. I kind of like and that really has struck with me recently I hear so many people sometimes say, well, boy, I can't wait until 2020 is over. Or when we get back to normal, what about 2021, 2022 maybe? There is no guarantee that we're even alive tomorrow. And so there are people there, I think, Phil, that really help me with seize the day. If you can do it now, do it now. There is no perfect time. There is no safe place. You can be dead tomorrow. I don't know, the thing that really strikes me with the end of Corinthians, Phil, is it's unresolved. Mm-hmm. What happens? Do the Corinthians repent or not? It's unresolved. And I think that's just the power of, as a preacher, I think that's isn't that what we live with? Like, how is this brother or sister going to take this conversation? What are they going to do? The other thing that strikes me, Phil, is that we have the Apostle Paul, an inspired man who started the work there, and it looks like a good number of the members are not listening to him. And when I left Beaverton, here's the thing that struck me, Phil, is I ran into some people that were very successful Christians, had great marriages, and were like doctors, Phil. And they said, there's some members that never come to me and ask for advice. And I think as a preacher, I don't know about Phil, but sometimes the thing that frustrates me a little bit is that you've got experts in the local congregation on all sorts of issues. And there are members that are not taking advantage of those truly experts and are pulling junk off the internet. I don't know, maybe that's the thing that really frustrates me sometimes, is that you see people and God is setting them up for success and handing them things, and they're dropping the ball on that. Now, I know I've done that in my life.
Yeah.
That certainly frustrates Jesus, but maybe as a preacher, that hard thing of seeing people, like I would say that God is setting them up for success, kind of like Israel. And now and then, Cindy reminded me this the other day, every little choice we make, Phil, isn't going to get us to the same place if it's not the right choice, if it's not the good choice. After 40 years, Phil, the little choices all add up.
Right. I'll go ahead and unveil. Sunday, I'll be speaking from Nehemiah 8, and the little blurb I've got to start the sermon isn't finally crafted, but the little proverb will come in. You can go very fast by yourself, but you will not get far unless you go with people, with a crew, with a team. I haven't figured out exactly how I'm going to phrase it, but that's the idea. And I think that is in part the message that Paul writes to the church at Corinth. They actually need each other. And in all of the solutions that he drops to the table for them, it requires them to do the very hardest thing for them, to work together. The only way they do what he says in 1 Corinthians 5 is to do it together. The only thing that he says to them in regards to their contribution is to lay by and sort of do it together. To solve their issues with the Lord's Supper is to do it together. To grow and sustain the relationships they need, to even keep quiet in their assemblies, it requires them to do that together. And that's the hardest thing for them to do. And how many preachers struggle with that too? How many preachers do you know that have the kind of ego to sit in a sermon and listen to the sermon that they need to hear that somebody else preaches, and they don't go on the inside? I really wish I was preaching.
You stop preaching and went to meddling there, brother.
Well, I got a crowd that I know can take it. I know
By
all
the
you
way,
guys have a strong enough heart to handle it.
By the way, Philip, you've got to use the title that Chuck Swindoll gives to Nehemiah 8. He is a Watergate revival. Watergate revival for a certain generation. That'll be it.
Generation, yeah. Hey, Phil, you're muted, Phil. Really quick, I really like Mark's comments. I just want to make a book recommendation. I know typical preacher talk to throw a book out there, but a few months ago, somebody got me on to Andy Stanley's book, The Principle of the Path. It is so basic and simple and great, and it walks you through the concept of destination is an accumulation of choices. But Mark, it also gets you to that idea of there are people who are already where you want to go. Why wouldn't you go straight to those people and say, tell me how you get there? He starts with submission to God in chapter 4 or 5, which is really important. First of all, you have to decide to give yourself over to God's direction, but then you have to see that there are people who've been following God's direction. And it is very frustrating. Maybe the number one local church frustration is to speak to someone. I'm not writing a Corinthian letter, but to speak to someone and say, look, there's a way to get there. And I don't know. I can't explain. I mean, I've done it. I guess I can explain it because I've done it. But it's a great book. It's so simply written that I think anybody would benefit from it.
And Mark will read that soon. Mark Russell will read that soon. He'll add it to his reading list. Dave Ramsey says all the time, stop getting your financial advice from broke people. You could reframe it and say, stop getting your spiritual advice from spiritually broken people. When the word and when your mentors that surround you are making the progress that you want. I mean, it's that simple. A couple quick comments. Hal Hemmons, I got you, Edwin. 1 second. Hal Hemmons says, so sparingly, reap sparingly, so beautifully, so bountifully, reap bountifully. Carl Peterson adds, the challenge for preachers, self included, is hearing a sermon and not thinking, this is how I would preach it, rather than, this is what I need to learn from it. Edwin, go.
So I guess just the comment about the path and not going to spiritually broken people. You know, the interesting thing here in the context of Corinthians is that the reason why folks aren't looking at Paul is they thought he was spiritually broken.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to throw out this caution and concern. A lot of times what we think is the successful person that I should go get advice from actually is not the biblically successful person. We think about the guy who's, he's got a great business and he's got a great retirement set up and he's very healthy and he's and their family is all this. That's probably how the false apostles looked. Whereas Paul looked like a guy who couldn't keep a home, couldn't keep a house. He was broke. He didn't, he's in and out of jail, and he does not look like the successful person as we as modern American Christians think. And so I guess I just want to back up and say, hey, let's just be really careful though, who we think are the actual successful ones that we're going to get our advice from.
I'll add to that we've all been spiritually broken at some point. And the reality is finding somebody who's not spiritually broken to some degree or in some area of their life just isn't realistic. But I think sometimes we use that as the excuse not to go to anybody and to develop within ourselves. What we've been talking about is just that we're trained to be very self-centered. In fact, this idea of not going to people but going to the internet, that's not just a church thing. I've got some relatives who are doctors who are looking at getting out of medicine solely because everybody who comes to their office already has diagnosed themselves before they ever show up. And by the way, that's a very real problem. And we're all guilty of that, right? Because we've all Googled symptoms we have, and we get an appointment knowing what we need. Like, there's been times like, hey, I just need a Z-Pack. I just got to come in here for the insurance. Just give me a Z-Pack. And that I'm not a doctor, right? So, but that's how people are. And we apply that to every area of our life. We have this access to this information superhighway that we think has made us so self-sustaining that we don't need anybody at all. And we can find a reason to discredit everybody. And I think one of the things to take into this is just, look, you look at the church at Corinth and chapter 6 is this amazing picture of transformation, but it's also an amazing list of reasons why you could discredit every person in the pew. Oh, that guy was a homosexual. That person was an adulteress. That person was an idolater. None of these people are as together as I am. If you're not careful, you could look at it that way, rather than realizing we're all broken people that are helping each other. And that's where that fellowship, that unity comes in that's so important in all of this. I just think that you can't overstate the fact that part of just who we are as disciples is understanding we cannot do this by ourselves under any circumstances at all. And that doesn't just mean that I need Jesus. Obviously that's what I need the most. But second to that is I need God's people in that process as well. I cannot be successful without the fellowship of other disciples in this journey that I'm on. It's just not possible. I think that's something we've got to get into our heads from all this. And I think Corinthians kind of helps us see that.
I would just add very quickly that unlike a doctor where you really do need to go to the expert, sometimes the people who can help you the most spiritually, sometimes they're the most fully developed veterans, and sometimes they're Janna Moore. You guys don't know Janna Moore. Janna's been a Christian for 4 days. Janna walked in the building last night with a smile across her entire face and changed the entire night. She changed everyone in the room. Spiritually, it's different. It's almost like Paul can go in, but he can also bring a Timothy who's still wet behind the ears from baptism, and they can both just change people. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it, about when you have Christ at the center. It's not about how long you've been a Christian. It's oftentimes not even about how much you know. It's about how much Christ is at the center of who you've emptied yourself and you've filled up with him. And I just can't get her out of my head today. Like her smile last night did more for our church than the 40 minutes that I stood up there doing my monkey symbols thing. And I just think it's the most beautiful thing that we're a part of, that the power is in Christ-centeredness, not in all the ways, like Edwin said, that we measure, success in this life.
By the way, I think sometimes we think the perfect person is who everybody needs, which is one of the reasons why leadership is so adamant at times at presenting this facade of perfection as if we've never sinned and we have it all together and we never admit any faults and we want to look perfect. But sometimes what people need more than perfection is that broken person that's still in the recovery process to show them that recovery is possible. There's so much to be gained by all of us. And I think sometimes there's more to be gained by seeing the other broken people who are still in the process of healing than there is somebody who's presenting themselves as having it all together when deep down in we know they really don't. I think it's one of the things that's one of the things I think sometimes we need to remember. This idea that we want to present ourselves as perfect, much like those guys that are attacking Paul in 2 Corinthians. That's really not what the church needs. And I think that's one of the things to see from that is that was actually a destructive kind of leadership. But it met every standard of what their culture looked for in leadership. And by the way, every standard of what our culture looks for in leadership as well. And that's not what they needed at all.
Yeah, for sure. And, as we kind of think through the rest of this big picture, I think, Mark, did you have something earlier? Mark does.
Yeah, I was just impressed that what we're going through right now with the virus and et cetera is a fair test of us. And I think something maybe not to be resented. I think it really, and the same thing would be true like the internet, where you're one click away from darkness and you don't have to go to some seedy part of town. That's really a fair test of who we are. I don't know, I'm optimistic, Phil, that I know a number of people might misuse this. And I know there are people that are, falling through the cracks or pushing themselves through the cracks or whatever. And I'm optimistic that the church is going to come out of this stronger, maybe a little leaner, but I think there's a number of congregations, Phil, that are going to come out of this more dedicated, stronger, because when you go through stuff like this, it can refine you like a fire. And if you can live in the 21st century and stay away from the darkness on the internet when it's one click away, I think you're the real, I think you're like, that's a fair test of you as a Christian. And so I know I'm optimistic about how the church is going to come through 2020. I think we're going to come through, at least a number of congregations I see. I like what I see on here. And I know that others are struggling and there's some things going on that are difficult, but I don't know. I know in Beaverton, there were some strong opinions about how we handle stuff, but the men met together. Hey, we want to do what's the best for the gospel. And I'd reiterate that. It's not my kingdom. It's not about my kingdom. It's Christ's kingdom. It's all for the gospel. That's my thought.
Yeah. And kind of thinking through that, if we're going to think about the wisdom and insight that comes through Paul's word to the church at Corinth in light of the conflicts at present and future, that kind of frames what can be maybe our last question. If you woke up from a slumber and this is what you see with your brethren today, whatever you see in them, whether you see the great highs that Mark is talking about, and Chris has mentioned when you see new souls in Christ and the power they bring, I think there's some insight for us to glean and say, okay, now this is the today we have. This is the only today we have. And as much as the pressures are strong in all these different areas to think that the serpent is winning and he's got a latch on victory, the serpent has been crushed. Like that outcome is settled. And the resurrection is real. And worship is still what God is seeking, and transformation is still what we can do. With enough impetus, we can even transform quickly. So thinking about this text, what would, like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, if you could offer it up to yourself of yesterday, and you just woke up today, what would you tell yourself? Like, this is what you need to hear. This will make today better. I know all of us are worrying about people West Coast, lots of fires, lots of strain, lots of stress nationwide, lots of confusion politically, lots of confusion spiritually, lots of confusion emotionally. Some of us have loved ones who are really stressed out. There's a message in the text for each of us. I've got mine, but I'll save it to the end, and maybe you guys will steal it and I'll have to pick a second one. Chris, what you got? You've been flipping pages. You've got some color marks. What would you tell yourself that you needed?
Well, the words highlighted in red.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question. Great way to end it. Some of it is what people have said already, what you guys have already contributed, that as a preacher, as a husband, a father, a Christian, I just need to be conduit for the message of Jesus. My purpose is to just get people connected to Christ and Christ connected to them. And that means that, I've got to be hollowed out, and that conduit wire's got to be hollowed out, except him, like his essence, his power. And so there are a couple of things that I take from this personally. One is just making sure that I'm not a block, that I'm not the block in the way of people getting to Christ and Christ getting to them, and us being about that mission. I don't want to make the mission about myself. I don't want to make it about self-defense, which has been an issue for me in the past. And also just this concept of sacrifice. I can say that. I could get up on Sunday and say, all right, guys, it's not about me. It's about Christ. And I just want you guys to know that I'm thinking about that. And, the only way they're going to believe me is if I'm truly emptying myself sacrificially so that the will of Christ can live through. You think about Paul and the listing in 2 Corinthians about all the beatings and the imprisonments and the sacrifices. He said, look, this isn't just wordplay. I mean, I gave everything up for this. And then the Corinthians and the Macedonians in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, I mean, you could say, hey, that's a great church that loves brethren. And maybe you would believe me. But if I told you that they didn't even have money to give, and they gave more than even they had to live on, they sacrificed, they emptied themselves so that the mission, it's a word Mark Russell used, the mission of Christ can just flow through them to you. And it because they took themselves out of it and they let it flow. I don't know. Those concepts, when I read this letter, make me want to work on me. And then hopefully, obviously, we're preachers here, Edwin, all the Shane. We also want others to follow suit. But when I say be an imitator of me, if I ever say be an imitator of me, what I want people to think is, hey, that guy has absolutely gutted himself of himself. And he's just Christ and Christ crucified all the time. And I want to be more like that for the sake of Christ. I don't want to be more like Chris for the sake of whatever. I want to be more like that. And I've got a lot to work on, but the mission for me going forward is clearer because of this study.
Yep. Mark Russell, you're next, because I said so.
Thanks. And following Chris, boy, appreciate it, Phil. Thanks. I guess for me, one of the things that has, in waking up, since I became an elder a few years ago, I don't look at the scriptures like I looked at it in my youth and immaturity as just a preacher. And the imploring self-sacrificial idea of this, and what to expect when I do what Paul is doing, when I try to teach, when I try to preach, when I pour myself out. In the past, I've always had expectation of, well, this will be a perfect church. This will be the perfect bride. And I think that has colored my view of what progress looks like. And I think the progress of, as Mark said, out of darkness into light, there are baby steps that sometimes folks need to take. And those baby steps are never fast enough for me. They never have been. And one of the things that I'm looking at in 1st and 2nd Corinthians is Paul's kind of like, I'm going to heaven. Here's what we need to do. I've done it. I've made mistakes, obviously. Well, Mark, but this is how we do it together. I can't go without you. I don't want to go without you. Terry and I, we have our love you and like you kind of a thing. I think Paul genuinely loved them, and I think he liked them enough to expend himself for them. And they got that. And that's what I want to do better. I don't want to just be the preacher. I don't just want to be the elder. I want to be someone who folks can see that I care about them like Jesus did. And I think that's the thing that has been kind of at the top of my list going through this again. Instead of that teacher, it's the guys, we've got a lot of stuff to work on, and it's going, and there's a lot of room for growth. But we can actually make an impact, and maybe even an impact on some brethren who don't have something that you have, like in 8 and 9 in 2 Corinthians. There is something for you to offer to other people. Let's be servants. And that's and the 9 to 5 Christianity. I don't know who said that, but that was brilliant. That'll preach. I hurriedly wrote that down. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna remember that one.
I tipped to Duggan. That was a Duggan comment.
Gotcha.
Yep. Citation.
But again, and I don't know if we're going to do around the horn, but I have thoroughly appreciated the stretch in all of this, brothers. Thank you.
Edwin?
So kind of tying, I want to say one thing, building off of what has already been said. I love the 12-step mantra. If we make it, I make it. And I think there's some good stuff here from what all you guys have said that highlights that. For me, if I woke up and boom, smack in the middle of 2020 and dealing with all the junk we've been dealing with, from the letters to the Corinthians, I think that conversation that we had in 1 Corinthians 2 about the triumphal procession, and at least the take that I have on that, and I know there was some disagreement about what it meant, but the take that I have on that is that Paul has been conquered. Paul has been conquered, and he is being led by Jesus as a prisoner behind him. And the amazing thing about it is that Paul himself realizes how amazing the conquering king is. And so being a slave and a prisoner to him, even if it means going to death, is an amazing opportunity. And that ties together with all the suffering. And Chris mentioned the suffering that Paul had gone through that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians. I guess I just want to say, yeah, this year's been tough, but I still haven't been beaten for my faith. I still haven't been put in prison for my faith. Nobody's walked into our assembly and started trying to arrest people where I am. I guess maybe that's kind of a thing that's getting started in some places. But in any event, just the realization that I can be a real whiner sometimes. And I just have to be reminded of Paul and how he was like, hey, today I've got the mission. I'm going to keep going. And I think that's the thing that I would try to carry with me and just remember. Paul did it. Hall of faith, like Hebrews chapter 11. Here's this great cloud of witnesses, and Paul is one of those. So I really appreciate that. And, let me just say this. If I woke up and got to, in the middle of all this, and got to watch this discussion, the bit about remembering we've got a mission and don't get distracted. And all of a sudden I'm realizing, I kind of have on some cases been kind of waiting for things to die down and get back to normal so I can get back to work instead of remembering. this is where we do the work. So I really appreciate those comments today. This discussion itself would help me with that if I woke up and saw it today.
This is, in fact, where we do the work. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Mark Dunnigan?
You know, I don't know, Phil, for how many years have Christians prayed, God, wake up this country, bring and I know I can't prove it. I can't prove that this is the method he's using, but you know what? I guess I would wake up and go like, it looks like that God may have answered all those prayers of bring us around and wake us up and bring about a national like repentance or whatever it is. That's something that would really strike me. How about this, Phil? I know a lot of people say like, wow, well, I can't wait until we get back to normal. You know what? I think what we're going through in 2020 is probably more normal than what we were going through the last 40 years, as far as what most people have gone through in history. I think it's more of a normal sort of, and I don't know, Phil, I'm not, the last 40 or 50 years for the church, as far as, I don't know, I think I would rather have things unsettled than what we had because I think about the last 40 or 50 years of the church, of everyone was eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, and kind of life went on like it did just for decades. And I think I'd rather have the turmoil right now, because I think Christians do a lot better in this than the slow frog in the pot. Life is comfortable, and I got my kids going to this and this and this and this, and my life is in this and this and this. And I know this about pop culture and that about pop culture, but how much do you know about the Bible? How much, and I don't know, maybe I'm just weird, but I kind of like now, I think now is better for us spiritually than what was going on, just the slow comfort of before. I think that was killing the church. So that's just my misguided, humble, whatever. I may be wrong about that, but I don't know. I think we do a lot better in adversity than we do in prosperity. I think prosperity is the danger. That's just
I just want to raise both hands and say Mark is an amazing person, and that was super awesome. I mean,
Chris raises his hand in worship. We know that now. It's been quantified. And I'll just say this, knowing each of you, Mark, you're probably the least weird of all of us. But Shane, you're up.
I think in terms of, what do I wish I could have told myself, in the past, having, read the letters again and studied them again. I think that, each of us is wired differently. I know that I am definitely wired with a very people-pleasing personality. I really resonate with when Michael Scott on The Office says, do I want people to love me or fear me? I want them to fear how much they love me. I mean, that's kind of that is my personality. And so it has always been very hard for me to be comfortable with confronting things that I think are in the best interests of the church, but which I'm always fearful that, somehow it's going to affect the way the members perceive me or, care for me or love me or whatever. And, seeing the way that Paul, somebody mentioned it earlier, it might have been Mark Russell, that sometimes we stigmatize Paul as this, hard line kind of personality. And in 2 Corinthians 6, he says, we have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. And then he asks them in return. Now, I like the old King James says, be ye enlarged, because that's like the one Bible command I've actually, carried out, but to widen your hearts also. Paul was an open-hearted preacher, and he wanted an open-hearted congregation, and part of having an open heart is caring enough that you're willing to take the slings and arrows if it's what's best for the church. And I think trying to grow up, it's really a lack of maturity that makes you a people pleaser, because you're dependent, So learning from his example about the way to do that is, it's not about you, period. It's about the Lord and what is best for his people is a lesson that I still constantly need to learn.
Terry?
So much has been said, I forgot the original question, so I'll just talk. Let me
Mute
Yeah.
button. Mute button.
No, let me say this. I really appreciated Mark Dunnigan's comments about where we're at. But I also have some anxieties tying that back to our mission, because where we're at right now, I see a lot of my brethren who have forgotten the mission. And maybe to just have some direct talk, our mission is not who gets elected. Our mission is not settling a dispute about masks. Our mission is not figuring out what the newest CDC release actually means about a virus. Our mission is not, this recording about whether the virus is deadly or not and what the president did. That's not our mission. And I see a lot of Christians who are really distracted from the mission. And what's really sad about that is that in these times of turmoil, God is able to do amazing things if we will stay on mission. And one of the things that I learned, not necessarily from this study, but ties into it, is just how often in the Bible God takes that which is counted as kind of worthless and out of need and recreates from that, often through some destructive process, that which is beautiful. And the guy in 1 Corinthians 5, I think, is a great illustration of that. Here's a guy who's made a mess of his life. Paul turns him over to Satan, which is a destructive process. And by the time he writes 2 Corinthians, I'm a believer that he's referencing to him there, that this guy has turned around, that through Christ, this guy has changed. He has stopped that immorality, that through that destruction came life, and came beautiful life, and came a life that Paul says needs to be shown affection and acceptance because the destruction was effective. I'm like Mark. I mean, people look on politics. I'm frustrated. I don't like either party. But people ask, "Well, is this the best we have? What does that say about us?" I think what that says about us is that's what we deserve right now. Like, I'm not so sure that one of the things from all of this is we're so distracted from our mission, and we've made that our mission. I'm going to give you two people that aren't really worthy of being there. Not so much to make you choose the lesser of the two evils, but to try to wake you up and make you realize that's not the mission. Like, quit throwing your support and all your effort into this every 4 years and get back on mission and start sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ and start sharing Jesus, start sharing the love of Jesus. I think that's what really our culture needs right now more than anything else. And like I said, I think we're just really too distracted because the fields are white for harvest right now. But all of our harvesters are arguing about whether they have to wear masks or not. And all of our harvesters are arguing about which party is better of a two-party system. And all of our harvesters are frustrated about the effects of a pandemic and a lockdown and all of these things that, by the way, are all fleshly. Like, all of those things one day will not exist. And that's where all of our discussion and effort and energy is going right now. And I think one of the things just to get back to is stay on mission. Stay on mission. If you stay on mission, what you see is destruction or worthlessness, God can turn into something amazing and beautiful, but you have to stay on mission. And that's one of the things I think just needs to be said.
Well, I am both surprised and thankful that none of you picked my particular answer to this. Mostly thankful.
I didn't want to talk about tacos today, so I left that for you. That's why I didn't bring that up.
Well, tacos in the garden, I've already moved them off the table. That's our first garden reference, by the way. But 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, Paul says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." If I woke up and had the ability to look backwards at myself, I would simply frame it this way. Do you believe that? Then either keep behaving like you believe it or start behaving like you believe it. That message was true for Paul. It's just as true as it is now for me. Why do I think that I am somehow or in some way able to behave like Hensley's Invictus and be the captain of my soul and the master of my destiny? God has a hand in everything, including whatever is going on right now. And it's going to be okay if I believe what Paul writes. So now we get to go around the horn. Mark was concerned there would be a around the horn moment, but we're going to get around the horn opportunity. By the way, for those who haven't been part of our earlier broadcasts, this is a chance to plug the things that are really important to each of us, maybe something in their personal work and their writing work, or just a message that Christians need to hear today. We've already kind of done part of that with our closing comments, but because we started, I think, with Chris, we're going to finish with Chris this time. And so we're going to go backwards. So that means that Terry gets to go right now. So around the horn, it's Terry's up and Terry's nervous.
Yeah, I was not expecting to go first. Wow.
This is the most we're doing this today.
Yeah. Well, let me say that not just the panelists that joined us today, but all the panelists, we really appreciate you doing that. And I know that's a sacrifice that takes time from your work and takes time from your family in many cases, and we're really appreciative of that. And the people who have listened in for so many of these and commented, really appreciative of that as well. For us, some people have asked, I'll just go ahead and say, Phil and I have made the decision to kind of suspend these Thursday studies for now. We'll remind you just to plug the Do the Work process that's every Tuesday. And while that's typically focused on preachers and church leadership, it's really good for all members because you kind of see an aspect of things you may not think about sometimes. Maybe it's the work of the preacher. Maybe it's an angle into shepherding the flock that you haven't thought about. Maybe it's the joys of that, and maybe it's the angst of all of that at times. But just encourage you to try to tune in on Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock Central, 11 o'clock Eastern time. If you don't tune in live, you can always watch it later on. And shout out to Phil. I get to be the lucky guy that's kind of the Robin to Batman in all of this. I don't think people realize how much money, time, and effort Phil has put into the ability to do all the things that he's done during this pandemic, especially his expertise on this video stuff and what he's been able to do has helped a lot of us, not just me, but a lot of us. I know he spent hours tutoring other preachers trying to catch up. And so he's kind of the spine of the Do the Work, and I'm just kind of the guy on the outskirts that gets to benefit from all his hard work. So I just want to close thanking Phil for his hard work. It doesn't go unnoticed, buddy. And just thankful that that you and I have reconnected over the last couple of years and that we've done this work together. I'm very appreciative of that.
Mr. Holmes?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually echo what Terry said. I think that this year we have all been flailing to try to figure out how to handle these circumstances. And I have certainly benefited from looking at what a lot of different brothers in the Word have been doing, through the course of this year. But certainly, I think, Philip, you and Terry have been at the top of the list of people who've encouraged me and given me ideas of things you can do. And I think we have all felt the sense of working even harder than we've been ever working before. And especially some of you have really had to go through these steep learning curves to learn a lot of technology. I'm like Terry, I am very much the barnacle on the ship of both at Valrico and also all these other studies. Other people do all this stuff. I just hit the button and talk. And I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate both of you and all of the work that all of my brothers and the Word are doing. I know we are all exhausted and limping to the finish line here one way or the other. And I just want you to know this year has certainly made me appreciate my fellow preachers even more, and just enjoy these opportunities to be together.
Mark D.
Phil, thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it. It was a great blessing to get that in my email, and just means a lot. And to spend some time and interact with the other members of the panel, and hopefully you'll send me your contact information so that when we're traveling, we can stop by and see you and spend some time and worship with you. A couple of things. One request would be keep us in your prayers. In this 2-year odyssey, I'm hoping I become a better person in the process. trust God more, worry less, things like that. So pray as we navigate and all of that. I'm just reminded, Phil, there's no safe place on this planet. For years, people in Oregon said no hurricanes here, no tornadoes, just mild weather. And, now the place is burning up. And so that's something I'm really struck with, is that I need to stop demanding that life go smoothly and that everything work out, and be grateful that I'm alive. I was talking to someone the other day, Phil. I heard about what was going on in Oregon, but a member of the church that I know called and said, pray for us. My, the wife is going through some diagnosis. We're not sure if she has Alzheimer's or not. And I said things like, I thought to myself, because I've got a little house in Oregon that could be burned down. That's, within a city that's under a ban. I can replace that. I can't replace my mind. And it just kind of puts things in perspective, like none of that means anything. And that my relationship with God, my marriage, my relationships with brethren, my friendships, my health and my mental health, etc., that's a lot more important than any physical possession that I have. And then I would say, seize the day. Don't put your life on hold. I know a lot of experts are saying, stay home, put your life on hold, but they're not putting their lives on hold. Don't put your Christian life on hold. Don't put your life on hold. The fields are still white for harvest. Those are my thoughts, Phil. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the show today.
Edwin?
What's important to me right now is that this study, the times I've gotten to be involved, and then study we've had recently, my coworker here, Andrew Roberts, let us in on the Sermon on the Mount. Throughout all of this, I guess, has really impressed me with how much I know versus how much I do. How easy it is for me to talk about it and get into really good conversations and hear really cool things and then get to springboard off of that and hopefully even say some neat things. And yet then in a minute, we're going to turn the cameras off and I go back to life, and it's very easy just to take the topwater stuff and apply it to my life and think I'm doing okay. And what I need is prayers that say, hey, we really want to live it. Chris mentioned earlier about Paul spending himself and spending himself out. I want to spend myself down to the buffer I've got in the bank account that, hey, I don't ever have to go below this. But hearing that reminded me, I need to spend myself out. And it's, I love getting to be on these things and talk about it. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It is a great honor, and I appreciate that. And so what I need is prayers to take all this stuff that we've said and really, in just a moment when the cameras go off, live it.
Mark Russell.
Well, I'd like to echo what Terry said and to thank you, Phil, because I have no idea how you restream and do all of this stuff, all the while keeping your attention and making somewhat interesting thoughts. I'm sorry, that was a cheap shot. I've known Shane forever, it seems like, and even though we've been parted through the years, and I've benefited from Edwin's work, and Terry is a good friend. I'm glad to get to see Mark and Chris and to be introduced to them. And I guess what I'm taking away from this and what I'd like for you all to understand is there's a lot of good work out there. I'm not as familiar with Mark's work, but I appreciate all of your work. And I'm wondering if in this COVID pandemic, if there's more gospel being spread, more seeds being sown now than ever have, in a way that 21st century Christians and 21st century unbelievers are getting in touch with. It's stretched our congregation into promoting and spreading and doing more that we can. And I guess the last thing I'd like to tell you is we've been worshiping inside since May. And I know that there's a lot of anxiety by a lot of people about doing those sorts of things. And as elders, we have sweated the process. But I want anyone who is sweating the process to know that it is possible. It is possible and likely that you can worship and distance and do the closest to normal worship and glorify God. And you can do that still and not be fearful of what might be coming. Now, I know that there are congregations who have made mistakes along that line, but I would like you to know that we haven't had an outbreak in Valpo. We've been masking and distancing and worshiping, and it really is refreshing to be with brothers and sisters like it's meant to be, and that unity can come. And I'd like to encourage folks who haven't and who aren't to know that it is possible. And again, thank you for asking me to be on this. It's been a blast.
Chris?
Charlie Tremendous Jones, he passed away about 12 years ago, motivational speaker. He said, "You will be the same person in 5 years as you are today, except for the people that you've met and the books that you've read." And I've thought a lot about that quote over the last year, and this experience, getting to know Phil and Terry better, and Edwin and Marks and Shane and everybody. And we're different because of the people that we've met, because we've heard perspectives that are outside of our own. I think in particular, as a preacher locally, you really just hear your own voice most of the time. And for the most part, all the members kind of are on board, and every once in a while we'll get a Tony Sellers, Phil, who will come in and be like, I don't know about that. But that's really only like 1% of the time. I'm really sure, I'm 100% sure that more than 1% of what I say needs to be rechecked. But it just doesn't happen a lot. And the way that you help with that is you have to expand new relationships, spend time around people who are smarter than you, read a few, there's billions of books, and Solomon spoke about that, but read a few books that are written by people who are better researched. And I did a podcast episode a week or two ago called Build Steel Men. Sometimes that means listening to a guy who totally disagrees with you and just absolutely giving him every possible benefit of the doubt to change you, which is so rare in what we do in local churches, because we're doing all the speaking. And then come back and see, Edwin called me a couple weeks ago and some kingdom stuff, and it affected what I taught last night. I taught something very different last night because he called and he explained it in a different way. And I think his argument's better than mine. And I'm different because of that kind of stuff. And so I would just tell people listening in, we mentioned earlier, there's just so much information out there and you can't listen to it all. Be selective, but listen to someone. I mean, build some new connections, and don't be afraid to read something that you know is going to fire you up, but don't get fired up. Not at first. Just listen and see. And this whole idea that we've got it all, editorial we, you can put whoever you want in the air quotes of we, but we've got it all figured out and we just need to hold the same lines. It's just ridiculous. And new relationships have helped to teach me that.
Thank each of you. I want to thank each of you for your time. Also, those guys who are not able to be with us today because of their schedules didn't kind of coincide with this. I have been richly blessed to be challenged to learn and grow in new ways. And I do appreciate your thanks towards me for all the tech stuff. There was a period of time where my eyes were twitching. And I was thinking about just slapping up my Cash App information and say, this is how much my time costs. Feel free to Cash App for purchase. Still an option though. If you want to throw me cash, I'm really not going to turn it away at this point. I got a kid in college. I'll take any penny you have.
You'll just spend it on tacos. We know what that'll happen there. That's the truth.
Yeah, at this point, pretty much all goes to college. Let's just be straight there. But I want to offer a couple of things I think are good for everybody. Mark mentioned assembling in person with your brethren. And my perspective is this: the building should never become the idol to our destination. Inside, outside, virtually otherwise, engage with the souls who are committed to Christ, whom surround you in your community. Eastside is temporarily doing the majority of its assemblies outdoors, and that will change at some point. And we'll move back inside, and that might mean multiple assemblies to comply with regulations, and that'll be okay. But the goal is to honor God. And so I want to encourage everyone first to really pour themselves out in worship or honoring God. Secondly, it's really easy to get bad ruts in a life that doesn't have much variation. So if at all possible, know this: it's perfectly okay to go outside and take a walk. If you want to punish yourself, play golf. If you want to enjoy it, just take a walk. And I say that, I'll pull this out and say, this is the stick of pain. You know, I've got one of those. But go out and take a walk. It's going to be okay. You'll probably be better off afterwards. And when you go on that walk, on a personal level, I'd encourage you to pray for people who you don't know, pray for people you do know, and right now pray for one young man in particular. Good friends of ours, Kevin and Jennifer Maxey, have their middle boy in the hospital. About 4 days ago, they recognized that he had some difficulties, brought him to the hospital/ER, and it was identified that his appendix had ruptured. And so he had emergency surgery for that. 24 hours later, he had a second surgery to deal with the consequences of that. And maybe 22 hours ago, 23 hours ago, they really didn't think he was going to make it. But while we were on the broadcast, I'm going to read a recent update that came just as we were starting today. And this comes from Kevin. Kevin writes, "We are overwhelmed with the love of Christ working in all of you, and do not have sufficient words to thank you or express how much it means to us. We thank God for you. Josh is at a crucial point and needs your prayers. We are praying that the fluid in the gas will stop backing up in his abdomen. We are praying that some of his abdominal organs will begin to work again very, very soon. We are praying that these things happen quickly so that Josh will not have to undergo a third surgery to insert tubes into his abdomen. Josh is more alert today, which is a wonderful blessing. But with that alertness comes a greater awareness of the pain and reality of what has happened. Pray for him to stay strong. We know that Josh's body belongs to the Lord, and his blood belongs to the Lord, and his breath of life belongs to the Lord. Please pray for these blessings today. Josh has been a frequent guest in our home. He has been part of the church at Eastside as a visitor and has offered prayers to the church here. He's close to my kids and maybe even some of yours. He's a good kid from good parents. And so for all those who are listening today, including our panelists, after we close off from here, I would encourage you to pray that God blesses that young man and that family, because they've been a blessing to us. Take care, everybody.